Good evening and welcome to the first Voices of Our Time event for the year 2008. For many in the audience this evening, the mention of our speaker's name evokes an era when our nation was fraught with divisiveness over a seemingly windless war. Roused by dissent in virtually every possible expression and experiencing social movements that changed the course of history. Those who were coming of age in the late 1960s and early 70s remember Daniel Ellsberg as a man who inspired young and old alike to consider the power of an individual acting on conscience, no matter what the outcome. Perhaps the students here this evening know Mr. Ellsberg through last week's Sechrist's Artist Series performance of the Pentagon Papers. Whatever the sources of your understanding of his role in that turbulent period, you surely know that Daniel Ellsberg, a scholar who earned his doctorate in economics at Harvard, and he told me tonight the day he passed his oral exams, he went into the Marines and became an officer, a line officer in the Marines. He acted on deeply patriotic instincts, despite the fact that he expected to spend much time in prison for having done so. As a trusted advisor to the Secretary of Defense, he was given access to more than 7,000 pages of documents, collectively referred to as the Pentagon Papers, that were assembled from a study of decision-making during the Vietnam War. His own evaluation of this complex collage alarmed him and shook his faith in those whom voters had entrusted with the country's security. Ultimately, Mr. Ellsberg made the decision to share the Pentagon Papers with the press. What followed was a series of events that seemed to validate Daniel Ellsberg's conclusions about decision-making at the highest level. He became the enemy of many, and when the Nixon administration attempted to discredit him, he also became one of the early victims of the Watergate plumbers, a circumstance that eventually led to the dropping of all charges against Mr. Ellsberg. Political activism has been the signature of Daniel Ellsberg's life and work ever since. As an author, lecturer, and organizer, he has been a consistent and influential voice for integrity in government and corporate life, and a crusader for peace. Recently, he has devoted himself to raising awareness of the parallels between Vietnam and Iraq, as well as a simmering crisis with Iran. We at Wake Forest are fortunate to have the opportunity to hear this evening from one who dared to act on his convictions and inspired generations of Americans to seek truth from those who hold power. It is my distinct pleasure to present our distinguished speaker, Daniel Ellsberg.
I wonder if it's possible to get the house lights turned up a little so I can see who I'm talking to. Is that possible? Hey, thank you. I once, one of the most embarrassing moments of my life that I remember, it's the only other time this happened, is when I was looking at an audience that was totally black. I couldn't, because the lights were in my eyes, I couldn't see anything out there. And I made this gesture up there to the person to turn up the lights like that instead of saying it. And the audience thought that I meant that I wanted a standing ovation. And they raggedly sort of began to stand up and so forth. And I've often wondered what I should have said about that at the time, but I just blushed, I guess. And we were also delayed out there a moment because I heard the announcement, turn off your cell phone. So, oh, what a good idea. And I was trying to turn off my cell phone, but it turned on, blink, blink. So I had to turn it off out here. Actually, I'm going to be talking about phones tonight, it so happens. A little more even than the analogy between Iran, Iraq, and Vietnam, which was announced some time ago, because there is, in fact, a threat at home, which is very immediate. In fact, there's a crisis. It's reached a sort of crisis today, in fact, hours ago. My own mind is focused on stuff that was we're speaking of cell phones here and everything, the modern technology. This came off the internet in the president's office about 20 minutes ago, about a vote in the Senate, or rather a move in the Senate today of extreme importance, I would say. And the importance is not going to be obvious on the surface to people, and I think it'll illustrate the main things that I really did want to talk about today. I talked about earlier in the day, and actually predicted, I must say, in a course here on campus, what this action would be today, and I'll come to that. In terms of an analogy between the Vietnam era and the present era, we were in the late 60s and early 70s in more of a constitutional crisis at home than I realized at the time, or I think almost anybody did. Very comparable to what we're facing right now, and in both cases it was because of an ongoing war, or at least it was rationalized by an ongoing war, a usurpation of authority by the president, by the executive branch, that very strongly threatened our democracy. And as I say, at that time, it was secret. I was recalling just standing out here, and I don't know if I've ever mentioned this in all these years since, publicly, but I remember speaking before the Fulbright Committee in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in May of 1970, and it was during the Cambodian invasion, which was taking place after I had started copying the Pentagon Papers in the fall of '69, and I'd given them to Fulbright already. But he called me for open testimony. I was still at the Rand Corporation at that time. And on what seemed a rather broad subject of the process of the war in Vietnam. I think it was actually Vietnamese domestic aspects of the war in Vietnam. It was kind of almost a marginal subject. But I heard the speaker before me say something about vital interests, and Senator Fulbright, in his Southern accent, I'm smiling here because I've heard more Southern accents than I'm used to today. Very nice, very, very nice. I'm not sure I've been in North Carolina since I spent 2 years slithering through the forests and swamps of Camp Lejeune back in the 50s, which was a happy time for me, actually, surprisingly enough. I was an infantry platoon leader and rifle company commander, and I was just telling the president that I was proud of the fact that I was the only first lieutenant in the 2nd Marine Division who had a rifle company, and I kept it for several months away from majors who wanted to get it away from me to get it on their record. Anyway, that was in many ways the most satisfying several months professionally in my life. I loved the job of being a rifle company commander, being responsible for those men. I volunteered. I was supposed to get out and go to Harvard in the Society of Fellows in June of '56. So I had to leave my company, which I hated to do, and start mustering out. And then it appeared that we were going to be at war, or there might be a war, in the Middle East, what came to be known as the Suez Crisis. And I couldn't stand the thought that my rifle company, and I'd also been the battalion assistant operations officer in charge of training, and I couldn't stand the thought that a company I'd commanded and a battalion that I'd trained might be in combat in what was forecast might be a Suez war without me there while I was back at Harvard. So I volunteered. I gave up my fellowship at that point and volunteered to stay in for an extra year, and did go to the Mediterranean in a Middle East, what turned out to be a Middle East war. And I won't go into that. We didn't, what actually happened. I did get my fellowship back, came back to Harvard, and then went to the Rand Corporation. Okay. So I was saying to Fulbright, I heard Fulbright saying, what is a vital interest to the previous witness? And I was thinking about that as I sat there. And I got up and I said, when it was my turn, Senator, that's a question I've often asked myself over the years. I'd been, by that time, 1970, I'd worked probably a dozen years for the executive branch, including 3 years in the Marine Corps. And we were always talking about vital interests. I said it was sometimes very hard to identify what is a vital interest. And I said, I think I know one right now. The United States has a vital interest in getting out of the Vietnam War. This was now 1970. I said, because if this war continues with the dissension and the acts that I see coming to repress that dissension, our country will change as fundamentally as if it had been occupied by a foreign army. And we have a vital interest in presenting that. Now, some changes had been taking place over the years that none of us knew, I'm sure including Senator Fulbright at that point. President Johnson, we now were under President Nixon, but President Johnson, under whom I'd gone to Vietnam in 65, 67, and following a year in which I worked on the escalation of the war in Vietnam in the Pentagon. Johnson had, in fact, by 67, looking at demonstrations and domestic threats of various kinds, and the Weather Underground hadn't occurred yet then. That happened under Nixon. But he was worried enough about demonstrations and dissent that he had unleashed not only the CIA against its charter and against law on for domestic intelligence, infiltrating groups, surveilling, writing reports, and doing provocative actions of various kinds, a thing called chaos, an appropriately named program, was all illegal. CIA is not supposed to have domestic police functions or domestic operations in this country at all. He had also been using the National Security Agency, the NSA, to surveil Americans of all kinds across the board. Dissenters, of course, but not only dissenters, quite broadly. In short, let me leap ahead in time here, what we now know President Bush has been doing, and not only since 9/11, but since March of 2001, within 2 months of coming into office. It was even more illegal under Bush than under Johnson, more clearly illegal to do that, although it's unconstitutional in both cases. In the case of Lyndon Johnson, it was clearly a violation of the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution, which forbids warrantless surveillance, invasions of privacy, in effect, observation of our domestic lives, without a court order, without warrant. The key aspect of that being that the founders of our Constitution and of the Bill of Rights in particular wanted it to be clear that the president did not have king-like powers of finding out the private lives and investigating, interrogating, that's another amendment, interrogating, Fifth Amendment, investigating without at least a court, an independent branch of government, having a say, having a look at what that was, and judging whether there was probable cause to suspect, not just a mere possibility of suspicion, but reason to believe that this person was guilty of illegal behavior. It hadn't been proven yet, but a strong reason to believe, probable cause. And without a judge judging that, the executive branch, whoever, FBI, NSA, CIA, whoever, was not to have the power to find out our private communications. Now, of course, they didn't have cell phones at the time of the Bill of Rights or internet, in fact. But the Supreme Court had ruled that this Fourth Amendment did apply to telephonic and other communications. This part, that it was part, in other words, of avoiding the kind of warrantless or general warrant searches that the British soldiers had routinely made of people they suspected of possible independence tendencies, and which was one of the great oppressions that was listed in the Declaration of Independence, and one of the things we fought a revolution to prevent. Okay, so Johnson had been doing this. By the time I spoke, he'd been doing it. He had done it from 67, and Nixon, of course, had continued it. So Nixon was doing it at the time of 70, which none of us knew at that point. Now, one way it did become known, it so happens, was that it was found that in the course of my trial, I had been subject to warrantless wiretaps by the FBI, it so happens. That came out right near the end of my trial, and not by coincidence that it was near the end. It was a factor in ending my trial. But it happened to come out after I'd been indicted for 2 years, and my lawyers had often asked the judge and asked for him to order, had I been subject to electronic overhearing? And the answer had always come back from the FBI, no, hasn't been overheard. Neither have we bugged him, nor tapped him, nor overheard him on somebody else's tap. That was false every time they said that. And finally, toward the end of my trial, someone leaked that from the FBI to the newspapers, came out in court. The judge asked for any records of this to see whether it might have affected the trial. And the then acting director of the FBI, Ruckelshaus, told the court with embarrassment, "We can't find any records of it." There are FBI people who testify, yes, they remembered the overhearing. They had heard me in various things, but there was no file of it. Now, the reason for that was, by the way, there was two aspects to it. In the first instance, FBI Director Hoover was so clear that this was illegal that he asked for a written order from it. He had to have direct order from the president through Kissinger to do this. And second, had kept it out of the FBI file system, which was, of course, against all regulations, but not probably unique. And he had kept the files of that in his own personal safe, his own private safe in his own outer office, along with other hot files of that sort. As soon as my trial started, it turned out, an assistant attorney general had realized that my lawyers would be asking about this subject, and thus Hoover had in his possession files with which he could blackmail the White House, showing that he had been directed to take illegal action against the Fourth Amendment. And that gave Hoover a kind of power that they preferred him not to have more of. He'd stayed in office for a generation on that way, blackmailing Congress, blackmailing various presidents. And so they suggested that they steal the files from Hoover, and this was passed on. And Hoover's number two, Sullivan, then had stolen the files, we learned later, stolen the files from his safe. They'd now disappeared, so my judge couldn't get them. And that was the final straw after the judge had been hearing for 2 weeks that White House people had tried to incapacitate me totally, had invaded the office of my former psychoanalyst. Why? Wasn't clear then. But I've talked to the person in charge of that now, Egil Krogh, who informed me they went into my analyst's office to get data that would not to put it out and discredit me, as is usually reported. I was on trial. I was facing 115 years in prison. They didn't really need to discredit me further than that, you might say. They were afraid that I had information on them of secret nuclear threats against North Vietnam, which he had made and which I'd heard about, but which I did not, in fact, have documents to present. Unfortunately, the people who knew of it hadn't made copies of those and hadn't given to them to me, or I wouldn't have put out the Pentagon Papers. I would have just put those out on Nixon. I wouldn't have bothered with history that dealt with Johnson and his predecessors. But Nixon was very reasonable, not paranoid, to believe that I might have had those. After all, people who had access to those threats and to plans for escalation, which he did carry out, the mining of Haiphong Harbor, going into Laos and Cambodia, escalations that did occur. People who knew of those did, in fact, resign from the White House over Cambodia. The very week I'm talking about when I talked to Fulbright. They were so appalled at that escalation of the war. Unfortunately, they did it silently. There was no press conference. They hoped the press would come to them and ask, and they had agreed that if asked, they would tell why they'd left. No press came and interviewed them, though it was known they'd resigned. And they didn't put anything out. So, and I hadn't learned of what they had. But Nixon had reason to fear they had given me documents on those secret and threats and plans for escalation, including the possible use of nuclear weapons. So he had to silence me. I think almost any president in that position, and he was not the only one to be in that position of making such threats, would have taken steps, illegal steps, to silence whoever it was who might disclose that, who might show it up. And in what he did then was to hire ex-FBI, ex-CIA officials, Liddy and Hunt, and use their CIA assets from the Bay of Pigs, CIA former agents, to go into my analyst's office to get information with which to blackmail me into silence, not to reveal, but to threaten to reveal, if I came out with these documents. And they didn't find what would do anything that would do that job. Later, the same people were brought to, when they felt I was about to reveal such documents, it's a longer story than I want to go into at this moment, but they had reason to believe I was giving out what I had through Senator Gravel, among others. And so they sent people up from Miami, the same crew, to incapacitate me totally, quote. And I asked their prosecutor later, they were being prosecuted because they had been caught in the Watergate a few weeks later. And I said, what does that mean? Kill me? He said, the words were to incapacitate you totally. But you have to understand, these guys, the CIA guys, never used the word kill. And he thought the point was to kill me. I think it really was. They used words like, some of you will remember in this audience, maybe, to terminate with extreme prejudice. Remember that one? Or neutralize. That was the word they used a lot. I know this is a wonderful mixed generational audience here, I see. I've been talking various audiences, for a long time, since the Pentagon Papers, and the years go by. And today I was talking to a very bright class of wonderful students who were had great questions and commentary and whatnot. And I mentioned that we need, at this point, in a variety of ways, the kind of miracle, a positive miracle, like the ending of the Cold War, like the downfall, the breaking down of the Berlin Wall. Something as incredible as that and unforeseeable as that, but as good as that. And then I realized, I looked at who I was looking at, and I said, how many of you remember that? And essentially none remembered it. Although, there was an exception or two. One young woman said she did remember that her parents doing what I did with our young child, put her in front of the TV and said, look at this and never forget it, And the other person, older, who was 9 at the time, he remembered that. And of course, they remembered, what's his name? Douglas Hassenpfeffer or something, somebody from Baywatch, Hasselblad. Yeah, a name not too familiar to me, actually. It's a general thing. At the same time, that was sort of, they remembered it that afternoon, but what's happening? A wall is being hammered at, big deal. But I remember what we said to our children. You'll remember this, don't ever forget this. I tried to search for an analogy. I said, it was like your parents saying, watch the moon tonight, it's going to split in two. It's just an amazing subject. Okay, but now I'm talking to a very smart class, very intelligent, who really have no memory of the ending of the Cold War in this amazing way, and of course of the Cold War that preceded it. So those of you who are anything like my age, other people here who are older than me, I'm 76. Let me see hands. Well, there you are. Not too many, but enough to remember those days. Okay, I forget where I left off on that long digression, but the general point is this. Nixon continued then the illegal activities that Johnson had done. So what I'm saying is that both Nixon and Johnson, a Republican and a Democrat, had done the same crimes that we now know President Bush has pursued since 2001 of illegal surveillance and a lot of other things. Actually, take this attempt to, we don't know whether American citizens have been targeted by incapacitation squads yet, but when it comes to warrantless wiretaps or break-ins, both of those have actually been legalized or quasi-legalized by Congress. Now, actually, they're unconstitutional, and by any previous Supreme Court, it would be clear that the laws, that the Patriot Act would be unconstitutional, and the so-called Protect America Act, which gives blanket approval for 6 months, this was in August, to the surveillance that had been going on, that they just discovered had been going on. So those things, a sneak and peek attack, entry into my doctor's office, no longer illegal without a warrant. Warrantless wiretapping that the president under Nixon had to keep quiet. Under him, those were crimes. And he knew it. And for that reason, he knew that just as he had potentially given Hoover blackmail capability, which he wanted to neutralize by stealing the records from him, he had now given this White House team of ex-CIA guys and Hunt and Liddy and their Cuban assets blackmail power over him when they were caught. They had other crimes to admit to a prosecutor if they were given immunity or if they were plea bargaining. So he knew right away when they were caught, he had to keep them quiet. Not only keep me quiet, but keep them quiet about what he'd done. In fact, it was more important, he could be prosecuted for that as well as impeached. So he had to offer them money to do it, pay their, quote, legal expenses. And in the end, he paid Hunt $140,000 to keep him quiet in front of the grand jury when, after he'd been convicted for Watergate, he was asked, then given immunity for further prosecution and said, okay, what other crimes did you do for the White House? And he said, none, having just been paid $140,000 on orders of the president. Now that, of course, was another crime by Nixon, obstruction of justice. And when eventually what Dean called, the counsel to the president, called a cancer on the presidency. You know, you do this crime, you've got to cover it up, that's another crime. You have to cover that up. More and more people know it's a cancer that's expanding, he said, and eventually somebody will tell a prosecutor. And eventually he told a prosecutor in his own plea bargaining process about the break-in to Fielding and about the wiretaps and so forth. So that was at the end of my trial, and that ultimately led to the dismissal of my charges. But more importantly, it figured in the impeachment proceedings against Nixon. Actually, Nixon, very few people know this, even at the time, or historians, have really noticed that the things that characterize Watergate in people's minds, the break-in to the Watergate, the dirty tricks, the campaign contributions and all that, none of that was actually ever traced to Nixon himself. He undoubtedly knew of it all, undoubtedly ordered it all, but never pinned it on him. Mitchell did not admit who he got his orders from. Haldeman and Dean kept their mouths shut. What Nixon was legally, criminally culpable for, I meant to say convictable for, was mainly what he did against me. Just happened. There was enough witnesses to that and enough proof that came out of the Oval Office that put him in trouble. And now Nixon, of course, did this, and I'm sure in his own mind, in feeling that what he was doing was not criminal. He knew that other people, like prosecutors that he didn't control, might regard it as criminal, which was a problem, but I'm sure he did not regard it as illegal for the reason he gave to David Frost later, which some of you will remember when he looked at the camera and said, actually it had to do with the Fielding break-in, the break-in to my analyst's office. And he said, explained to Frost, when the president does it, it's not illegal. Aren't there people here who remember that broadcast? Let me see hands. Yeah, okay. It's like the Berlin Wall of broadcast or something. But he didn't say that as president. He didn't try to argue that what he had been doing was, after all, legal on the grounds that he undoubtedly believed in his heart, which was, but didn't try to sell while he was president, that the president is beyond the law, that the president can do whatever he wants. It's legal because he does it, because he thinks it's necessary, and is not constrained by legislation, by the Constitution, by international law, by courts, by Congress, by anything. He's a law unto himself. Now, Nixon didn't invent that philosophy, but he didn't try to pursue it even in his own defense while he was president. He got himself a pardon. Obviously, it's increasingly clear that he named Ford as his replacement on the understanding that Ford would pardon him, which, by the way, is a crime in itself, which was a little embarrassing to Ford and which he denied forever. But I'm saying that's the most reasonable interpretation of what Ford did in that case. And the reason, a major reason why Ford couldn't get reelected, actually. But as I say, it was not on the grounds. What he did, by the way, was pardon him for any crimes he might have committed without knowing what they were at that point, a blanket pardon. Nobody at that time argued then that he should not have been subject to impeachment proceedings, he should not have faced prosecution, given that he was president, for whatever he'd done. Some people did infer that, did believe that at the time. It turns out that Richard Cheney, who worked in the White House at that period, under Nixon and then under Ford, and then was, I believe, Ford's Secretary of Defense. But he was in the White House. I think he was the chief of staff. Maybe the Secretary of Defense was later, I guess, under the first Bush. But he was chief of staff for the White House. It's clear now, though not to me as a voter in 2000, I didn't vote for him, but I was not aware. What is now clear from a lot of biographies of Cheney, and there's a book called, I believe, Takeover by Charlie Savage of the Boston Globe, which is very good on this, that Cheney watched this Watergate process at that time, we're talking 72, 73 now, with the belief that Nixon should not have been regarded as potentially indictable for any of these things. He had a right to do them because he was president. There was a war on, he was commander-in-chief, and that he certainly should not have faced impeachment, he should not have been impeached if it had come to that, and so forth. Cheney was not alone in this, undoubtedly. When Cheney went to the Congress, he took these attitudes with him, executive branch attitudes, which were not so different from what I held, or most people held in the executive branch. We thought the president makes foreign policy, the president makes defense policy. What if I'd been asked at that time, when I was in the Pentagon and the State Department, if the president does it in his own belief that it's for the national interest, national security, it's not illegal. I don't know what I would have said, but I wouldn't clearly have rejected that. It's a widespread executive belief. But it wasn't held in Congress at that time, and it wasn't held in the courts. And Nixon was drummed out of office, basically, for acting on that. Cheney, as vice president, it turns out, came into that office with an agenda that went back over 30 years. And the agenda, as he puts it, was to restore the power of the presidency. But by that, he didn't mean restore it to what it was before Bill Clinton or something. He meant restore it to something that would have kept Nixon out of any trouble, given that he did what he did, because the president does, in fact, have the right to do whatever he thinks necessary, without any court, without any appeal, without anything. That's his philosophy, and it's not only Cheney. He had it in Congress, a legal aide, David Addington, who, by the way, drafted for him an objection to the Iran-Contra report when Cheney was in Congress, the majority being very critical, to say the least, of Reagan and Bush. Then Bush, the older Bush, was vice president. And the majority report written by Cheney said they hadn't done anything wrong in giving arms covertly to what they called a terrorist state, which they were not supposed to deal with, Iran, in order to get money to circumvent Congress's denial of funds for any covert operations in Nicaragua. In other words, they gave arms to terrorists, as they saw it, to get money to arm terrorists in Nicaragua against the will of Congress, which is supposed to be in charge of all the funds, of all the appropriation. And they got some of the other money from friends in Saudi Arabia and Bahrain and elsewhere. And as Cheney saw it in the report, that should all have been regarded as illegal because the president thought it was necessary. Well, that's a while ago. And then, as I say, we now know he came into office with this belief and has enacted it as vice president to a really fairly extraordinary extent. an extent that I would not have believed possible, with as much secrecy and as much approval ultimately of Congress as he's actually gotten. Now, let's bring it right up to what's going on now. A very specific question, and I've been talking about cell phones and warrantless wiretaps, is this matter of warrantless surveillance. Surveillance in two respects. Purely at the instigation of the executive, intrusive, investigative, and broad. Now, I had in the government a dozen clearances higher than top secret. None of those, the existence of those was known to a handful, 8 or 9 actually, senators that I briefed just after my trial, which was chaired by Senator Ervin, who was, you remember, the chairman of the Watergate Committee. Ervin did not know there were clearances. As he said, well, they've sworn to us, a dozen times there are no clearances other than secret, confidential, and top secret. I said, well, that's false. The only guy in that group, which included Fulbright and Eagleton and I think McGovern, a number of others, the only man who knew otherwise as a senator was Senator Symington, who had been Secretary of the Air Force, and he knew it as Secretary of the Air Force. So here were all these clearances on information that the senators not only didn't get the information, they didn't know the clearance existed. Now, the lowest of those clearances was for communications intelligence. Very important, but what we intercepted worldwide. And I was very aware of the activities of NSA in listening in on communications all over the world, not only the Soviet Union, but in particular, actually, satellites and other countries the Soviets communicated with. Often their codes weren't as good as the Soviets, so we could learn stuff about the Soviets from listening to somebody in Africa that they were dealing with. So, okay, very important to national security. There happens to be a law that does make it illegal to reveal that stuff, communications intelligence. And actually, I don't object to that law. It's important. It has to be secret. And but I always was aware, and this goes back to about 1960, of something that Senator Church learned when he did the Church Committee in 1975. I don't know whether he'd known anything about these clearances and about this process before that. I had, as I said, as a consumer of that intelligence. But why was there a Church Committee? Because thanks to Watergate, and I say my own trial, and so forth, they investigated the crimes of CIA, the crimes of the government, and so forth, discovered the extent of all this wiretapping, which went back not only to Johnson, but well before that, into the Cold War, and decided one of the major outcomes of the Church Committee was what was called FISA, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which was to make clearly domestically illegal the gathering of intelligence on Americans in America, not intelligence, but listening in on their communications, without a court order. And it set up a secret court to make sure you could maintain the secrecy of the process, but at least have a judgment other than the executive branch, by somebody other than appointed by the president, as to whether there was a reason for listening in. You could listen in, but you needed a warrant. Now, I think what we've now learned is some 14,000 requests or something came to the FISA court, of which they refused 5, something like that. So to accuse it of being a rubber stamp is not too rhetorical. Nevertheless, they did look at it. And in principle, you had this process subject to a Fourth Amendment protection of a judge looking at it. The reason for that, as I say, was that Church, having discovered that the NSA had been used so much against Americans going way back, but especially under Johnson and Nixon, felt we've got to make it, really pin it down, that there is a process for listening, but it's a legal constitutional process. As he put it, having learned to their NSA technology, here's what Church said on Meet the Press in 1975. What's that, 25 but 8, plus you do the arithmetic, years ago, third of a century ago. That capability at any time could be turned around on the American people. something I'd worried about since 1960. I could always see, what if they start listening to Americans? As I say, it happened. It was happening. I didn't know that. I said, what if they start listening to Americans? Well, Church said, and no American would have any privacy left. Such is the capability to monitor everything, telephone conversations, telegrams, it doesn't matter. Remember, this is 75. That's before faxes, cell phones, email, internet, all of which is equally, in fact, more easily decipherable. It's all digital, it can be transcribed easily. It's easier than listening to audio tape. There would be no place to hide, said Church. If this government ever became a tyranny, if a dictator ever took charge in this country, the technological capacity that this intelligence community has given the government could enable it to impose total tyranny, and there would be no way to fight back. Because the most careful effort to combine together in resistance to the government, free association, it's called politics, political parties, political factions, the most careful effort, no matter how privately it was done, is within the reach of the government to know. Such is the capability of this technology. He said to Meet the Press, I don't want to see this country ever go across that bridge. I know the capacity that is there to make tyranny total in America. And we must see to it that this agency and all agencies that possess this technology, and it's not only NSA, operate within the law and under proper supervision so that we never cross over that abyss. That is the abyss from which there is no return. Now, I remember back in 2004, I was feeling 3 years ago, if there's another 9/11, this country is going to change drastically. The president will get every capability he wants, and I believe he wants total surveillance. They'd already indicated, they wanted the total information program tips or something, have all your meter repairmen and your police, firemen, everybody who comes around the neighborhood a lot to be sending in information, neighbors to be reporting, babysitters to be reporting what they see. That was the brainchild of, what's his name, Admiral Poindexter, and who anyway, had a career in Iran-Contra. And that had been supposedly stopped by Congress. And if they do that, there's no real possibility after 9/11, I thought, another 9/11, second 9/11. They'll do that. People will want security. They'll say, we need to hear everything. And people will give it to them. There'll be no resistance to it. I didn't know that had been happening, not only since 9/11. When it was finally discovered, the president said, well, after 9/11, very urgent, we did start listening. And the NSA director, Hayden, said, yes, I took it on myself. I couldn't have forgiven myself if I hadn't done this. Why was it an issue? Because it was illegal and unconstitutional and against FISA to do this without warrants and on a mass basis, sucking everything up. Turns out that was a lie, too, because they'd started in March. Well, 7 months before 9/11. Why exactly, I don't know, but except that they thought that was the way things should be. And we didn't learn of it. The Times learned of it, New York Times, learned by leaks in October of 2004, a month before the election. But the White House asked them not to put it out. It would endanger national security. So they didn't. And not for another year did they reveal that story in December 2005. And they did it then because their reporter, James Risen, was about to publish a book within weeks that would reveal it all and reveal that the Times had been sitting on it all this time. So they put it out. They got over their qualms, the White House concerns about national security, and they did reveal it. So then there were some hearings at which Gonzales, then Attorney General, absolutely refused to tell them what the NSA was actually doing. He said there's a very narrow program where we're listening to Al-Qaeda people talking to Americans. Well, who can object to that? But is that all they were doing? And why did they need to do that without a warrant? The warrant court would issue that very easily. They didn't explain why they had bypassed FISA in clear contradiction to the law, violation, and the Constitution. They never have explained that. The obvious reason would seem to be two things. That they were doing it on a mass basis, as their number of leaks have indicated, sucking up everything, what church feared. And they were doing it without any court intervention, whatever, choosing to do it because it was so clearly illegal and could not be justified in terms of national security. And a number of NSA people were so worried about it that it was not necessary, not justifiable, and was criminal, that they did leak to no effect. The program just went on. And I'm sorry, I'm going to have to go a little longer than I planned because I have to finish this thought. Okay. Last August, then, Congress, never having found out what NSA is actually doing, anyway, passed a law that in effect legalized it. Now, you can't change the Constitution, the Fourth Amendment, by passing a law. Other Supreme Courts would have found that unconstitutional, clearly, and whether this one would or not. And if they don't find it unconstitutional, it's because they have a different view of the way the way the country should be run, this Supreme Court. But it hasn't been tested. As far as Congress was concerned, though, they legalized it, but only for 6 months. Why did they do it at all? Because they were leaving on vacation, and the Democratic majority under Pelosi, the House, pushed that through, lest something happen while they were on vacation in August, and the president would say, without necessarily the scrap of basis or evidence, that they were the fault, that the Americans had died because they hadn't let NSA do this. Now, the chance that NSA would have stopped doing it because they didn't have a law is zero, so, that wouldn't be, they would have just done it the way they'd been doing it for 7 years already. But because they believe they're beyond the law, and the president orders it, it's not illegal. But anyway, they got Congress to, quote, legalize it, but only for 6 months. We were going to revisit it after vacation, so in 6 months, so that we will fix that law up and make it less unconstitutional. The House actually came through on that pretty largely about a month ago and passed a bill that did actually expand the powers of NSA, but did keep some surveillance, some accountability, some appeal, and so forth. The key issue that the president wanted was twofold. In August, and he didn't get it in August, that's why the 6 month thing. Permanent authorization of this, for what that's worth. I mean, he doesn't really care what the law says, is what it comes down to, but just for the record, make it permanent for future presidents. And second, give immunity from civil suit to the telephone companies for whatever it was they had been doing for the last 6 years, which was clearly illegal. Now, they have a right to argue in court under the House bill that they did this in good faith, that they thought it was legal, that the president had directed them, and so forth. But that might not fly because Quest Communications had refused the request of NSA on the grounds that the program was clearly illegal, blatantly illegal, and they didn't want to do it. And that undermines the position of the other companies a little bit. They were making money doing something that was in fact blatantly illegal. So the president has been, now my time is up pretty much, but I just want to finish this point, bring it up to tonight. The president has, and Cheney in particular, has lobbied for this immunity for really two reasons. They want the full cooperation of the telephone companies in this unconstitutional, illegal program of surveillance, as they've had, except for Quest, for the last 7 years now. And they don't want them to be worried about being sued about it. That's one thing. Two, the only way of finding out what the NSA and the telephone companies have been collecting all this stuff and giving it to NSA. The only way of finding out what they're collecting, which has been leaked, is everything. But the only way of determining that, for sure, is in these civil suits that people have been bringing to find out, who they were listening to and why. Give them immunity from civil suit, it means the telephone companies are beyond the reach of courts and of the law and of recourse just like the executive branch, just like NSA itself. Now, if you can't get it through, by the way, the telephone companies, you could say, well, the Congress could have put something in a law that made for appeal, for accountability in NSA, but there's nothing like that has been proposed. Okay. The Democratic leadership in the Senate, Harry Reid, has said now for months, we're going to fix this up, and of course we're against immunity. He said today, Harry Reid, the Senate Majority Leader, said, I oppose immunity. But what he did this afternoon, after I talked to the class, how many people were in that class this afternoon? See some hands? Well, I just see one, but I hope there's a few more came tonight. I predicted that what did happen, though not in detail, what did happen was Harry Reid says, I oppose it, but he tabled the bill that kept out immunity, the bill by the Judiciary Committee. The Judiciary Committee under Leahy opposed immunity and put forward a bill that didn't have immunity in it. So there could be civil suits against the telephone companies. Reid says, I oppose immunity, but he tabled that bill, meaning he effectively disposed of it. And the only bill that he put forward was one that had immunity in it. This is like pretty much what Pelosi did on a number of occasions back in August. Said, I oppose this, I vote against it, but she gave it fast action that shot it through. Chris Dodd has said right along that he would filibuster against that bill because it's unconstitutional and dangerous. And he's going to do that. But the way Reid did it, it turns out this afternoon, came across at 5:07, the way he did that was in a way that is going to make it easy to stop Dodd. Hillary Clinton has announced she's not coming back an hour and a half from South Carolina to join Dodd in that filibuster. Edwards says he would have joined him if he was still in the Senate. But they're going to stop. And I guess, and Obama has not been heard from on this point. It's going to go through in the Senate. The president is going to get what he wanted on this, which I say, which is not only broad powers which the Senate and House do not even know what they're authorizing. Go back to the Ford pardon. Whatever crimes have been committed, they've in effect saying whatever the NSA has been doing, whatever it is, which they won't tell us. Secret. It's a secret. They won't tell the Congress in secret session what they're doing, but it's okay with us. Now, you could say that it's been lawless for 7 years. Now, in a certain sense, it's about to be lawful in some sense. This is not the rule of law is not operating here. In fact, as Glenn Greenwald, a legal scholar I refer you to, who writes for Salon.com, Glenn Greenwald has written articles on this, and he's been predicting that it would come out this way. And he said historians will not be able to decide whether there was a Congress during these years, or whether it made, certainly that it made any difference for the Democrats to have this chairmanship. What it comes down to is they are so afraid, approaching elections, of being accused by the president falsely or without basis of helping terrorists by letting the telephone companies off of. The telephone companies have been lobbying with enormous amounts of money on this point now for a long time, including to Jay Rockefeller, head of the Intelligence Committee. Okay, the president will say, you're weak on terrorism, you're costing American lives. Totally false. But rather than try to educate the public on that, better to give him whatever he asks so he can't make that charge substantively. He can't say we denied him whatever he wants. But that means you end up, as Democrats, giving him whatever he wants, which is what they've done up till now in every respect. On the war, on Iran, terrorist organization, on everything else. And unfortunately, what this president wants, and Vice President Cheney wants, is total power. You can't have a democracy in a country where the executive branch knows all of your phone calls, all of your emails, all of your faxes, all the electronic communications of any kind, which is, I think, where they are now. Not that they listen to it real time, and the Senate is helping them do it, except for exceptions, like Chris Dodd and some people in the House and so forth. This will go to committee between House and Senate. It'll have to be worked out. Well, make a bet as to how it'll be worked out. If we, the people in the country, rise in a way that hasn't happened in the last several years and demand that the House stand where it is in protecting the Constitution here, it could conceivably do that. That's not the way to bet with money, but it's the way to press, it's the way to political, and if you look into this, you can find out which House members on the committee to look into it should be pressed to do their duty. But with that the church was right. That's an abyss from which there's no return. It isn't just that they hear your electronic communications. As we know from other experience, with that kind of information, they can blackmail people into informing them about things that weren't on tape, that were not electronic, the things that were said in the bedroom or in the living room. When my trial ended, it so happens the next person to occupy my apartment, our apartment, found bugs in the bedroom and the living room throughout the trial. So the person who found it had been in Army counterintelligence, and he recognized the bug when he discovered it. But that was illegal. Make it legal, make it constant, make it broad, and so forth. And what you don't have is the America that the founders had in mind, a sovereign public. You have a country of informers. You have a country of total information awareness, as they said they wanted. You have East Germany. Now, I asked this of the class, they were too young, but have people here, aren't there some who have seen the movie that won the Academy Award for foreign films just a couple of years ago, The Lives of Others? Yeah, it's about East Germany. And what you have with that system is East Germany, a country of informers, and a country of informers because people were forced to be informers because of being blackmailed, as they tried to do to me, as Hoover wanted to do to the White House, et cetera, et cetera. A country of informers that tell them who are informers because they were blackmailed because of what the government learned on their electronic communications and other informers. That's not America. Now, you know, as in East Germany, life goes on. People get married, people have jobs and children, and they live. In East Germany, it's sort of a minimum security prison. And not so minimum for some people, but it's quite livable for others, for most people. And that's where we are at this moment. As I said, I thought it would be after the next 9/11. No, it didn't take 9/11 even, unless we do something about it. I'll end with this thought. How could we learn enough to change this? Not from the executive branch and not from Congress, which, unable to get the information from the president, simply says, okay, whatever you're doing is legal, is okay, we'll go along with it. We don't need to know. You say it's for saving the lives of Americans. Probably not one congressperson in 10 or 100 believes that. But they'll act as if they did, rather than be accused, be called names by the president. So what we need, we'll come back to the title of the talk in a way, not just because of Iraq, but because of our need to remain a democracy. And I want that not just because it's an idea and a tradition, but because I've come to learn that the founders were right the first time on that Bill of Rights. They had it right on the need to protect free speech and free association so as to hold the government accountable for its wrongdoing. You needed checks and balances. Yes, it doesn't make for perfect efficiency, the kind you have in a dictatorship, the kind that launches great wars of aggression. It turns out that democracies, quote, can launch wars of aggression. We just did in Iraq. But what helps that a lot is the kind of secrecy that dictators dreamed of and couldn't always get. Well, actually, they could be very secret. I take that back. But they didn't have the kind of surveillance that presidents now have, which gives you effectively, will give you a kind of dictatorship. I think we now have a king. It's not just a possibility. It's not just an idea in George Bush's head. With the complicity of Congress, both parties, we have monarchical government or dictatorial government. Or is it as bad as it could be? No. It's not as bad as it's been in other countries. It's not as bad as it's going to be under another 9/11. Or if the war goes to Iran. It can get a lot worse. And I don't think it's irretrievable. Take the issue that I just said, for instance. The Senate is just facing this process by Chris Dodd. He is going to filibuster. He's going to do what he can to stop this, with perhaps a few others helping him. That will be almost surely overturned by closure, in which Democrats vote to stop the filibuster. And then they have to, so it'll be next week before the Senate decides this, and then it'll be a while more before the committee, they go to the two things together. This could still be stopped by the House, actually, at this point, by public pressure on the House to stand up on this. And the reason to stand up is, I say, it was worth fighting for a democracy over 200 years ago, and it's worth struggling for it and fighting for it right now. And I don't think that's going to happen without more leaks of the kind that did reveal the NSA program, even though they didn't stop the program. But people did leak. They did put the word out, risking their careers, and I'll end on one positive note. You haven't heard too many from me, I admit. We were heading, I think, much more likely than not a few months ago toward war with Iran, which would be another catastrophe. And the Senate, including Hillary Clinton, as it so happens, had given a green light for that, essentially. The other candidates chided her for that vote, calling the Revolutionary Guard a terrorist organization, which is virtually a Tonkin Gulf resolution to this president, giving him delegation. I think that was the way to bet. It's still possible, and a lot more than a little possible. It's still significantly possible under this president, because he thinks he can do anything. And he wants to attack Iran. That's a whole other story, but let me just assert that as my judgment. Not only mine. But this time, national intelligence community, which back in 2002 discreditably, outrageously went along with the president's desire to put out a false national intelligence estimate indicating a belief that Iraq had a nuclear weapons program, which they really didn't believe, and which was a factor in the war. In fact, Hillary particularly points to that, and Kerry, as a reason for their vote in favor of the war. They went along with that. It's terrible. This time, a national intelligence estimate said a couple of months ago, that there was no nuclear program in Iran and hadn't been for years. Totally contradicting the president and Cheney, who were saying the opposite all last year, up till this moment, knowing the intelligence that was coming up to them at that point. And they're still saying it, though now they have to admit that it's in disagreement with the intelligence community, which is helpful. How did that ever get released, undermining the president? Quote from a news story, because intelligence analysts, officials, were lined up to go to jail if they didn't release that summary, which, by the way, they had said weeks earlier, the administration said, we will not release this summary to the public. And they did, because it was about to be leaked. Sort of like the New York Times. They finally had to put it out because one of their people was going to publish it. And rather than having been found out that they'd been hiding this all this time, they released it. The Times released it. The administration released it. Unless those people had been willing to go to jail, we wouldn't know that. And it comes back to what I discovered some time ago. Their secrecy agreements were in conflict with another promise they'd made, which was not an agreement, it was an oath. This was an oath. They talk about secrecy oaths, but secrecy are really agreements, they're contractual agreements. The oath you take of office with your right hand up and you swear, so help me God, by every civilian official and every military officer and every member of Congress takes the same words as oath, military and civilian. And it is not an oath to the president or to the commander-in-chief, the Fuhrer, even for the military. It's not an oath to keep secrets. It's not an oath to get your party reelected or get a president on it. It is simply an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And it took me a long time to realize that I had been violating that oath for years when I did not put out the information I had that Congress was being manipulated into a war, in fact was being lied to, and take their function usurped, which is to decide on war and peace, which is given only to Congress in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. As far as I know, the only constitution in the world that I know of that gives the legislature, the parliament, that sole power. A fantastic invention in the world, a very, very good one, which we've pretty much discarded over the last years, since Harry Truman, I have to say, in Korea, but ever since that, though some lip service is paid to it. Now, the lip service is you ask Congress, but you lie to them, and you manipulate it, and so forth. You don't just totally ignore them. Not good enough. The secrecy promise contradicts that oath, and the oath should take priority, although it almost never does. And what these national intelligence officers did was they obeyed their oath, finally. They revealed the truth, or they threatened to reveal the truth, and the truth got out. And that reduced the likelihood of an aggressive war, a new crime of aggression, not to zero, but to something that maybe we can reduce still further if we work at it over the next year. Keeping our democracy, avoiding a new war like that, was worth the lives and sacred honor and fortunes of the founders of this country. It's worth my life and my freedom and my secrecy, my sacred honor to the end of my life. I'm not officially bound by that oath, but I certainly intend to live by it for the rest of my life. And I admire and thank the people in the government who have, at last, stood up to that and obeyed that. And let's work with them and try to keep our democracy. Thank you.